Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really significant and, frankly, a quite disturbing subject: the current state of human rights globally.
It certainly is.
We've got a stack of information here, mainly the Global Human Rights Deep Report.pdf. It pulls together expert analysis from, the big organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch,
Right.
and includes some deeply concerning case studies on specific vulnerable groups.
Yeah. Some really tough reads in there.
So our mission today is to kind of cut through the noise, extract the key insights, and really understand the major challenges. What are the crucial things you, our listeners, need to know?
That's right. And it's not just a list of awful things happening. It's about seeing the connections. Yeah.
Sure.
Understanding the forces actually driving these trends.
Okay.
We'll look at the big picture from the main reports, but then zoom in on specific situations to see the human impact.
Right, get a clear, concise picture of what's shaping human rights right now. Okay, so let's dive straight into this troubling global picture then. What's the headline from these major reports? Amnesty, HRW, the UN's OHCHR. What's the main message?
The headline is, unfortunately, a persistent decline, a real drop in global freedoms.
Okay.
All the big players. And you mentioned Freedom House. They noted 2024 was the 19th year straight of this decline.
19 years. Wow.
Yeah. They're all painting a pretty consistent picture of things getting worse, not better. And it's not just isolated stuff. It's the same worrying trends popping up everywhere.
Such as, what are these recurring red flags?
Well, primarily, we're seeing governments really clamping down on dissent. Harder.
Okay.
Restricting freedom of expression, freedom of association, the right to form groups and the right to protest. That's a big one. Then there's the absolutely devastating impact of armed conflicts. They're still the main drivers of the most severe violations.
Right.
Add to that inadequate climate action that's huge, a really disturbing backlash against marginalized groups.
Who are we talking about there specifically?
Migrants, refugees, women and girls, LGBTQ plus individuals, they're facing increased hostility. And then there's the failure, really, to regulate new tech properly.
Technology, so surveillance, discrimination.
Exactly. Leading to more surveillance, more potential for discrimination. It's a complex web.
It sounds like these things are feeding off each other. And I remember HRW saying something quite stark, even about established democracies.
Yes, that was a key point from HRW.
Yeah.
Even countries we think of as, solid democracies are showing real inconsistencies
How so?
in upholding human rights, both at home and, crucially, in their foreign policy. It just shows that no one's immune. Protecting these values takes constant effort everywhere.
Okay, let's zero in on one of those major themes then. The escalating impact of armed conflict. The report paints a truly awful picture in Sudan.
Tragically awful. Sudan's facing the world's largest displacement crisis right now.
The largest.
The largest. And widespread famine on top of that. The
Yeah.
violence against civilians is just horrific. Attacks on camps, hospitals, schools, places that should be safe.
Unbelievable.
And there are these horrifying reports of ethnically motivated killings, systematic sexual violence used as a weapon. The UN OHCHR, they documented over 4,200 civilian killings just in 2024.
Just staggering numbers.
And a key factor, the report stresses, is impunity. This deep-seated lack of accountability just seems to fuel the fire, letting these atrocities continue.
And the situation in Gaza is described in equally devastating terms, isn't it?
Absolutely. The humanitarian consequences since October 7th have been catastrophic. Full stop.
What are the key findings there?
Well, Human Rights Watch talks about potential war crimes, crimes against humanity. Amnesty has raised allegations of genocide.
Serious allegation.
Very serious. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, found a plausible risk of genocide and issued provisional measures. The UN's own Human Rights Office described conditions as, quote, apocalyptic.
Apocalyptic.
Well,
That's, clearly needs urgent, sustained attention.
Without a doubt.
The conflict in Ukraine also hit a grim milestone in 2024.
Yeah, Russia actually killed more civilians there in 2024 than the year before. Yes, continuing this pattern of targeting civilian infrastructure. And the reports of torture, enforced disappearances. They just keep coming. Deeply troubling.
And Myanmar, another situation with a brutal escalation.
Sadly, yes. Since the coup in 2021, the internal conflict there has just intensified dramatically.
How so?
Record levels of military airstrikes in 2024. Over 6,000 civilian deaths reported, more than 3 million people displaced.
3 million.
Yeah. And again, deliberate targeting of schools, hospitals, crippling essential services. And the violence against the Rohingya minority. It's at its worst levels since the 2017 genocide.
And the same people involved.
That's the chilling part. Individuals implicated back in 2017 are now part of the ruling junta. It speaks volumes about the danger and the absolute lack of accountability.
This all paints such a disturbing picture. It feels like the basic rules of war are just being ignored.
Precisely. International humanitarian law is being flouted just time and time again with impunity, and it's civilians overwhelmingly who bear the cost. This lack of accountability just perpetuates the cycle.
Okay. Another major trend the report flags is this rise in authoritarianism and the shrinking of what's called civic space. It sounds like governments are actively trying to silence dissent.
That's a very accurate way to put it. We're seeing more laws, more policies specifically designed to shut down critical voices and, frankly, to entrench power.
What kind of tactics are they using?
Oh, a whole range. Banning media outlets, dissolving NGOs, opposition parties, imprisoning critics, often using these really vague anti-terrorism or national security charges.
Right, those catch-all charges.
Exactly. Criminalizing human rights defenders, climate activists, journalists, lawyers, even just peaceful protesters.
The report gives some pretty chilling examples from just last year, 2024. Can you walk us through a few?
Sure. I mean, in Bangladesh, during student protests, there were reports of shoot-on-sight orders. Some reports suggest around 1,000 deaths. Just shocking.
No bows.
Yeah. Mozambique, a brutal crackdown on post-election protests. Again, hundreds dead. Turkey, continued blanket bans on protests, excessive force, blocking online content. Instagram got blocked, and prosecuting journalists, especially Kurdish journalists, under these broad anti-terror laws.
It seems relentless.
It is. Venezuela, after protests, killings, disappearances, arbitrary detentions. Vietnam, using laws like Article 331 more and more to go after online dissent, especially around religious freedom. Tunisia, seeing more arbitrary detentions, political motivated prosecutions, again using terrorism charges against critics. And Sudan, amidst the conflict, journalists killed, detained, widespread disappearances. It's a global pattern.
It really highlights this strategic dismantling of checks and balances, doesn't it? When you silence independent voices, journalists, activists, lawyers, what's the wider impact?
Broader impact is huge. You create an environment where other violations can happen much more easily, with less scrutiny. Corruption, environmental destruction, persecuting minorities. It can all happen under the radar, or at least without organized challenge. That's why the monitoring by bodies like the UDHR is so vital. When governments block their access or just ignore them, it's bad news all around.
It's not entirely bleak, though, is it? The report does mention some pushback.
That's true. There are glimmers. We saw martial law overturned in South Korea, a powerful judicial pushback.
Okay.
And the mass protests in Bangladesh did lead to a major political resignation. It shows popular mobilization can still have an impact. Even in tough environments, they're important reminders of resilience.
Right. That change is still possible. Now, climate change. It's increasingly framed not just as environmental, but as a core human rights issue.
Absolutely. The report is crystal clear. The climate crisis is a profound human rights crisis. And 2024 being the hottest year on record just hammers home the urgency.
How does it directly impact rights?
Well, think about it. Intensified floods, like we saw in South Asia and Europe, droughts in Southern Africa, wildfires in the Amazon, stronger hurricanes hitting the U.S. These destroy homes, livelihoods, access to food and water.
Undermining basic rights to life, health, housing.
Exactly. And it disproportionately hits vulnerable populations. What's really alarming is how climate change acts as a threat multiplier.
Threat multiplier.
Yeah, it worsens existing inequalities. It pushes marginalized communities into situations where multiple rights collapse at once. Food, shelter, safety, health. They all become intertwined and fail together.
And international efforts to tackle it still falling short.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
COP29 faced a lot of criticism. Too much influence from the fossil fuel lobby, failure to agree on proper, equitable funding for the transition.
So what's needed?
Strong calls for a human rights-based approach. That means a rapid, fair phase-out of fossil fuels and massively scaled-up climate finance based on mostly grants, not loans, reflecting historical responsibility. We're talking huge numbers, like the USD $1 trillion target for the new finance goal.
The report also connects this to specific environmental justice issues, like Cancer Alley in Louisiana.
That's a really stark, tragic example. You have this heavy concentration of fossil fuel and petrochemical plants in an area with a long history of slavery and racial discrimination,
And the impact.
disproportionately harming the health of predominantly black residents, significantly higher cancer risks, problems with maternal and newborn health. It's environmental injustice laid bare. Like the Flint water crisis, another painful example.
And indigenous peoples are often on the front lines, too.
Yes, absolutely. Often the first and worst hit by climate impacts and by conflicts over resource extraction.
Like the Thacker Pass mine.
Exactly. The proposed lithium mine there raises serious concerns about violating cultural and religious rights of local indigenous communities. And deforestation in the Amazon driven by agriculture, logging, mining, directly threatens indigenous lands, livelihoods, their very cultural survival.
So protecting environmental defenders and indigenous groups is key.
Crucial, not just for their rights, but for effective climate action too. On a positive note, we are seeing some legal evolution. Courts in Kenya, South Africa are starting to advance the right to a healthy environment. Slowly, but it's progress.
Technology, then. All its potential, but also a real double-edged sword for human rights.
That's a critical point. The tech is moving so fast, much faster than the safeguards. That creates huge risks.
Like surveillance.
Yeah, increased use of sophisticated surveillance tools.
Right.
By governments, private actors, too. Big privacy concerns, obviously, but also the potential for misuse against activists, journalists, minorities.
And artificial intelligence, AI. Could that make things worse?
It absolutely could. If AI isn't developed and rolled out with a really strong human rights framework baked in, there's a massive risk. It just entrenches existing biases.
In what areas?
Policing, hiring, access to services.
Yeah.
If the data is biased, the AI outcomes will be biased, potentially amplifying inequality.
Social media platforms, too. They have a dark side here.
Unfortunately, yes. Often with inadequate oversight, they become huge channels for abuse, hate speech, disinformation.
Undermining democracy and rights.
Directly. The report notes the Trump administration rolling back content moderation as a negative step, and states like Turkey actively blocking platforms like Instagram shows ongoing restriction of online expression.
Is anything being done? It's encouraging the UN is starting to address this.
Yes, the UN Human Rights Office is setting up a digital technologies advisory service. The idea is to guide states and others on embedding human rights in AI and digital tech governance.
And the Global Digital Compact.
Right, integrating human rights into that in 2025 is a key priority. The goal ultimately is ensuring technology serves humanity and our fundamental rights, not undermines them.
Funding. Always a critical issue. The report highlights some really concerning shortfalls for human rights work.
Indeed. The ability of bodies like the UDHR to do their vital work is seriously hampered by funding issues. Constantly.
Despite needing more money.
Exactly. They appealed for about $500 million for 2025. But voluntary contributions actually decreased in 2024. Human rights funding is still a tiny fraction of the overall UN budget. And the UN's wider cash crisis doesn't help.
That seems especially alarming right now, with global turmoil and threats increasing. A dangerous mix.
It absolutely is. The High Commissioner Volker Turk makes the point that investing in human rights is actually, low cost, high impact, especially compared to the massive costs of conflict and crises later on.
Makes sense.
And despite the constraints, OHCHR did manage a lot in 2024. Monitoring missions, trial observations, documenting violations, supporting survivors. It just shows what they could do with proper resources.
So the warning is clear.
Very clear. Failure to invest means violations go undocumented, impunity rises, defenders lack protection, discrimination persists. Ultimately, lives are put at risk. It's a dangerous gap.
The report then really zooms in, using detailed case studies of specific vulnerable groups. Let's start with the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, China, described as one of the most severe crises today.
Tragically, yes. Under this broad banner of counter-extremism, the Chinese government has carried out a systematic, widespread campaign against Uyghurs and other Muslim groups in Xinjiang.
The numbers are hard to grasp.
Credible estimates suggest well over 1 million arbitrarily detained since 2017. Some sources put it as high as 3.5 million in these so-called re-education camps.
And the violations documented, they're horrific. Can you outline the key abuses?
It's a long and terrible list. Mass arbitrary detention, obviously. Intense political indoctrination inside the camps. Survivors report torture, widespread ill treatment, including sexual violence, forced anal exams. Forced labor is widespread, often linked to international supply chains. A systematic campaign to erase Uyghur culture and religion, destroying mosques, suppressing the language.
Just erasing identity.
Completely. Rampant family separation, hundreds of thousands of kids taken from parents, and deeply concerning evidence of coercive birth prevention, forced sterilizations, abortions. That raises serious concerns about potential genocide.
Genocide.
Plus mass surveillance of the whole population, enforced disappearances of intellectuals, community leaders. It's comprehensive persecution.
Then Beijing justifies this as counterterrorism.
Yes, consistently.
Yeah.
They use national security laws, anti-extremism regulations. New ones came in 2024 to give it a veneer of legality, but it's widely seen as instrumentalizing the law to justify gross violations.
What about the international response? Has there been any real accountability?
The response has raised awareness, definitely, condemnations, reports. The UN's own Human Rights Office released a damning assessment finding potential crimes against humanity.
But China rejected it.
Vehemently dismissed it, and efforts to even get it formally discussed at the UN Human Rights Council were blocked, largely due to China's influence.
So limited concrete actions.
Some countries have issued joint statements, imposed targeted sanctions, but meaningful accountability, it's elusive. China denies everything, blocks access. And without unified Security Council action, which China would likely veto things like an ICC referral, are off the table.
Okay, let's turn to the Rohingya in Myanmar and Bangladesh, another tragedy with a long, painful history.
Indeed, a stateless Muslim minority from Rakhine State, persecuted for decades. Then the brutal clearance operations by the military in August 2017.
Which were labeled as genocide.
Yes, the UN and many rights groups characterized it as genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. Over 720,000 fled to Bangladesh. Now nearly 1 million refugees live in dire conditions in Cox's Bazar. About 600,000 remain in Rakhine, facing ongoing threats.
What's the current situation for those still in Myanmar? Is the violence over?
Sadly, no. Renewed fighting in Rakhine between the junta and the Arakan army has led to more displacement, more attacks on Rohingya. Observers say it's the worst since 2017.
So still denied basic rights.
Completely. Citizenship, freedom of movement, humanitarian access is severely restricted, and a new conscription law enforced this year just adds another layer of fear.
And conditions in the Bangladesh camps? You said dire.
Extremely dire, severely overcrowded, makeshift shelters vulnerable to disasters, cyclones, fires, limited access to essentials, food, water, sanitation, healthcare, education.
Leading to health problems.
Widespread malnutrition, especially children, significant mental health issues, plus major protection concerns, movement restrictions, high risk of violence, exploitation, trafficking, child marriage, child labor fueled by gangs, and many still risk perilous sea journeys. It's desperate.
Are there any paths to justice for the Rohingya?
Efforts are ongoing internationally. The International Criminal Court, the ICC, has an investigation open. The Gambia took Myanmar to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, alleging genocide. The ICJ ordered provisional measures.
Any other legal avenues?
A universal jurisdiction case in Argentina. UN mechanisms are collecting evidence, deploring the persecution. The UN High Commissioner keeps calling for citizenship rights.
But progress is slow.
Frustratingly slow. No domestic justice in Myanmar, obviously. International courts take time. No UN Security Council referral due to likely vetoes. Not enough humanitarian funding for the camps. And crucially, a lack of political will for safe repatriation. There's just this huge, deeply concerning gap between the atrocities and effective justice or protection.
Moving to the Brazilian Amazon, the rights of indigenous peoples there face increasing threats from deforestation and resource extraction.
Absolutely. Indigenous communities are the traditional guardians of the Amazon, a vital global ecosystem, but they're facing escalating threats.
From what sources?
Illegal logging, mining, cattle ranching, agricultural expansion, these drive land grabbing, deforestation, and a really concerning pattern of violence and intimidation against indigenous peoples and environmental defenders trying to protect their lands.
The report highlights a big shift in government policy between Bolsonaro and the current Lula administration.
Yes, a stark contrast. The Bolsonaro era was openly hostile to indigenous rights and environmental protection. No new territory demarcations, weakened agencies, rhetoric that emboldened illegal actors. Deforestation and violence soared.
And Lula.
A promised course correction, restructuring agencies, restoring funding. FUNII, the Indigenous Affairs Agency, renamed and now headed by an indigenous person. Land demarcation restarted 6 new territories recognized in April 2023.
And the Supreme Court ruling.
Crucially, they rejected the Marco-Temporal thesis, which would have severely undermined indigenous land claims. Lula is also pushing to ratify the Escazú Agreement on Environmental Democracy and Defender Protection.
But despite these positive steps, challenges remain.
Yes, unfortunately. Powerful agribusiness and mining lobbies still hold sway in Congress, pushing laws to weaken rights. Violence against defenders continues. Effective implementation and ensuring land security remain huge, ongoing challenges. It needs sustained political will.
What's the international view on this?
Repeated concerns from international bodies about the threats, calls for stronger protection, accountability, encouragement for Brazil to ratify Escazú, and growing recognition of the vital role indigenous peoples play in biodiversity and climate mitigation. Brazil's actually advocating for the right to a healthy climate at the Inter-American Court right now.
Okay, finally, the case study on LGBTQ plus rights in Uganda, a truly disturbing picture of state-sponsored persecution.
It really is. Same-sex intimacy was already criminalized under a colonial-era law with life imprisonment. But the 2023 Anti-Homosexuality Act, the AHA, marks a severe, deeply concerning downturn.
Considered one of the most extreme laws globally.
Absolutely. It criminalizes just holding out as LGBTQ plus calorie, life imprisonment for the offense of homosexuality, the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality.
Death penalty.
Yes, and criminalizing promotion of homosexuality up to 20 years. Penalties for facilitating acts. Even criminalizes same-sex activity between women. While the Constitutional Court struck down a couple of provisions like mandatory reporting, the vast majority of this awful law was upheld. A Supreme Court appeal is pending.
And the impact on the community has been devastating.
Immediate and devastating. A sharp, alarming rise in violence and discrimination since it passed. Rights groups documented over 1,250 violations affecting over 1,000 people in just the first 8 months.
What kind of violations?
Increased physical attacks, harassment, extortion, arbitrary arrests, reports of torture and detention, including forced anal exams, evictions, displacement, denial of health care, family rejection, and civil society groups like Etzamag, shut down in 2022, face huge risks. The promotion clause just creates this climate of intense fear, chilling any advocacy.
What's driving this, and how has the world responded?
It reflects a long history of anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment among some political and religious leaders, sadly fueled partly by influence from anti-LGBTQ plus groups abroad, including from the U.S. or ISO. Specific MPs and activists championed this 2023 law. It builds on past efforts. The rhetoric often frames LGBTQ plus rights as a foreign imposition clashing with traditional values.
And the international reaction.
Widespread condemnation. The U.S. called it one of the most extreme. Significant diplomatic and economic pressure followed. The U.S. terminated Uganda's HOA trade eligibility. The World Bank suspended new public financing. Concerns were raised about U.S.-funded health programs like HIV/AIDS work.
So real consequences.
Yes. International human rights bodies, UN experts unequivocally condemned it as violating international treaties. Urgent calls for repeal, or at least a moratorium, plus funding for support services. Uganda really highlights how discriminatory national laws cause severe violations and prompt significant international backlash. It starkly shows the tension between national law and international norms.
These case studies really bring home the diverse ways rights are violated. The report then goes deeper into a fundamental issue: cultural perspectives and the universality debate.
It does. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR from 1948, is the benchmark, right? Proclaiming rights inherent to all humans. But the debate is, do these rights truly apply equally everywhere, across all cultures? That's the universalism versus cultural relativism question.
Can you quickly outline those two perspectives?
Sure. Universalism says, basically, yes, fundamental rights apply equally to everyone, regardless of culture, because of our shared humanity. Cultural relativism argues that morality rights, they're shaped by cultural context. Relativists often critique the UDHR as Western-centric, saying rights need adapting to local norms for legitimacy.
Which raises tough questions about challenging harmful practices versus respecting cultural differences and state sovereignty. What are the main criticisms of each view?
Well, strong relativism is criticized because it can be used to justify abuses, ignores diversity within cultures, and lacks a universal grounding. States sometimes use it to deflect criticism. Rigid universalism can be seen as insensitive to local contexts, faces implementation challenges, and is sometimes accused of having a Western bias historically.
The report mentions ways to navigate this tension, finding common ground.
Yeah, looking for shared core values, an overlapping consensus. Maybe weak cultural relativism, universal rights as a starting point, but allowing limited, justified variations. And crucially, fostering genuine intercultural dialogue.
Regional human rights frameworks show how this plays out. Let's start with the African Charter.
Right, the Banjul Charter. It explicitly reflects an African perspective. Includes not just individual rights, but collective people's rights, self-determination, development, peace, environment. Uniquely, it also mentions individual duties to the community, more holistic, overseen by the African Commission and Court.
Then the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam, often seen as quite different.
Indeed. While it affirms many rights, its key feature is subordinating all rights to Islamic Sharia, declared the sole reference point. This draws criticism for potentially limiting freedoms like religion, expression, and equality, particularly for women and non-Muslims, seen by many as limiting the UDHR's scope. A revised OIC declaration exists, maybe moving closer to UDHR standards, but its real impact is unclear.
And finally, the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration.
Adopted in 2012, aims to reaffirm UDHR principles in Southeast Asia's context, adds some rights, but heavily criticized for invoking cultural relativism, allowing domestic law to limit rights and having weak enforcement due to ASEAN's non-interference principle, generally seen as the weakest regional system.
The report includes a helpful comparison table. Key differences seem to be individual versus collective emphasis and enforcement strength.
Exactly. You see a spectrum. UDHR primarily individual, African Charter explicitly collective. Enforcement ranges from non-binding declarations to regional courts, though even courts face compliance challenges.
Beyond formal declarations, there are specific cultural lenses, like the Asian values debate from the 90s.
Right. That argued some Asian societies prioritize social harmony, order, authority, community, over Western-style individual liberties. Confucianism was often cited. It was sometimes used to justify authoritarianism. Critics said it oversimplified diverse Asian cultures, lacked evidence linking values to development, and was often just a political tool for elites.
And Confucian ethics itself, how does that fit?
Confucianism emphasizes relationships, social harmony, duties within a hierarchy, virtue cultivation, li, yi, ren. Community often prioritized over individual autonomy. Some see tension with individual rights and equality, but it also includes moral constraints on rulers. Mandate of Heaven emphasizes benevolence. There are ongoing discussions about its relevance today for governance, ethics, emphasizing relational responsibilities.
Finally, indigenous worldviews bring a crucial, often different perspective: collective rights, connection to land.
Absolutely. Indigenous perspectives often prioritize collective rights, self-determination, and that deep, inseparable connection to ancestral lands. This challenges more individualistic frameworks. Self-determination covers political status, development, cultural preservation. Free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, is central regarding land and resources. Collective rights to land, resources, heritage are paramount. This can create internal tensions with individual rights sometimes, and there are fundamental differences with state views on land ownership. But these worldviews offer a vital corrective to purely individualistic models.
Okay, let's shift to the actors on the global stage, starting with intergovernmental bodies like the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR.
Right, the OHCHR, headed by Volker Turk currently, plays a crucial multifaceted role, setting standards, monitoring situations worldwide, supporting treaty implementation, assisting UN mechanisms, field presences, technical help, documenting violations, advocating for change.
A huge mandate.
Huge. Manages trust funds too. But, as we said, faces chronic funding shortfalls, which seriously impact its work. Its reports carry weight, but impact depends on political will from states.
And the UN Human Rights Council, often in the news.
The main intergovernmental body, 47 member states. Key mechanisms: Universal Periodic Review, UPR, looking at all states' records, special procedures, independent experts on themes or countries, and fact-finding missions. It adopts resolutions, holds debates.
But its effectiveness is limited.
Often, yes, by member states' political interest, leading to accusations of selectivity. Debates on universality continue within the Council. It lacks direct enforcement powers and struggles to effectively address powerful states.
Major international NGOs, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, FIDH are also key players.
Absolutely crucial. They operate independently of governments. Their main roles: investigating abuses, documenting them meticulously, advocating for victims, mobilizing public pressure.
Can you give a flavor of each? Amnesty.
Known for research and action, campaigns like Right for Rights, advocacy, media work, lobbying, education. Annual global report, big grassroots membership, Nobel Peace Prize winner. Focus on freedom of expression, equality.
Human Rights Watch.
Their motto is investigate, expose, change. Rigorous field investigations, detailed reports, media outreach, targeted advocacy. Importantly, refuses government funding for independence. Credited with impact on things like the ICC, landmine ban.
And FIDH.
That's the International Federation for Human Rights, a federation of 184 national organizations. Vision, protect victims, prevent violations, or prosecute perpetrators. Strong focus on defenders' rights via its observatory, women's migrants' rights, fighting impunity, supporting ICC universal jurisdiction, corporate accountability, conflict rights, uses fact-finding, trial observation, research, training, advocacy, litigation support, urgent alerts, emergency grants.
So these NGOs provide essential independent information and pressure.
Exactly. Their independence lets them be critical. They lack formal enforcement, but their influence through research and advocacy is huge. They complement and sometimes challenge the UN system.
Beyond big organizations, the report stresses the power of individual human rights defenders and the role of awards.
Yes, absolutely vital. These are people working peacefully, often at great personal risk, to promote and protect rights.
Facing threats?
Often threats, intimidation, violence. But their role is indispensable. Documenting violations, supporting victims, pushing for reforms, raising awareness, holding actors accountable. They get support from UDHR and NGOs like FIDH's Observatory.
And international awards.
They recognize contributions, raise awareness, and can sometimes offer a degree of protection through visibility. The UN Prize in Human Rights, Nobel Peace Prize Malala, Nadia Murad, Amnesty itself, others like the RFK Award, Sakharov Prize, Martin Ennals Award.
The report mentions specific examples.
Yeah, people like Malala, Nadia Murad, Wad al-Kataib, imprisoned Chinese activists Zhu Jiang and Li Qiuchu, indigenous leaders in Brazil, LGBTQ+ activists in Uganda. Their stories show the power of individual courage and collective action, and the need for strong links between big international bodies and grassroots movements.
Okay, despite all these actors, significant obstacles remain. A fundamental one is the sovereignty dilemma. Non-interference versus the responsibility to protect.
Exactly. State sovereignty, non-interference in internal affairs is a bedrock principle, but governments often hide behind it to avoid scrutiny of their rights record.
And R2P, responsibility to protect.
R2P from 2005 reframed sovereignty as responsibility. States have the primary responsibility to protect their populations from 4 mass atrocities: genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity.
It has pillars.
3 pillars. 1, state responsibility. 2, international assistance to help states protect. 3, collective action by the international community if a state manifestly fails. Peaceful means first, then coercive measures as a last resort, authorized by the UN Security Council.
So it tries to bridge the gap.
Yes, reinforces sovereignty when states protect, challenges impunity when they fail. But Pillar 3, intervention, is highly controversial and politically constrained. Security Council authorization often blocked by vetoes. Libya in 2011 remains contentious. The Rohingya crisis is often cited as a failure to intervene due to sovereignty concerns.
And the enforcement mechanisms of international law themselves have limitations.
Big limitations. International human rights law binds states, but enforcement is weaker than domestic law, relies heavily on state consent, cooperation, political will.
How do different bodies compare?
UN treaty bodies monitor, review reports, hear complaints, but their decisions aren't binding. The Human Rights Council is political, relies on diplomacy, lacks direct enforcement, struggles with powerful states. The ICJ settles state disputes with consent, judgments binding, but enforcement via Security Council is subject to veto. Played a role in Gambia v. Myanmar, Gaza provisional measures.
And the ICC?
Prosecutes individuals for atrocities. Independent, but relies on state cooperation for arrests, evidence. Limited jurisdiction, lengthy, costly processes. Accused of bias. Major powers aren't members, its effectiveness is debated.
So where is enforcement most effective?
Often through national laws and independent domestic courts, but those are often weak or compromised. Other means include diplomatic pressure, sanctions, NGO advocacy, the transnational legal process. Fundamentally, the state-based system limits coercive enforcement. Progress depends on interplay of norms, pressure, interests, advocacy.
Another challenge, accountability for non-state actors, like corporations or armed groups.
A critical growing challenge. The traditional state-centric system struggles with powerful non-state actors.
Like armed groups.
Rebel groups, militias, terrorist groups, responsible for abuses and conflict, bound by international humanitarian law if party to conflict. Their human rights law obligations are more debated, but there's a growing trend to argue those with government-like control must respect fundamental rights. The UN condemns ANSA abuses, but engaging them, ensuring compliance, huge challenges. States still have a duty to protect people from ANSA abuses too.
And corporations.
Big impacts on labor, environment, land rights, especially indigenous, even complicity in abuses.
Mhm.
The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, UNGPs, from 2011 offer a framework: state duty to protect, corporate responsibility to respect, including due diligence, access to remedy, but they're soft law, not binding.
So challenges remain.
Definitely. Defining responsibility across supply chains, legal hurdles for victims, corporate influence on regulation. There's a trend towards hard law. Mandatory due diligence laws are emerging. Economic incentives are shifting slightly too. But addressing this accountability gap needs innovative approaches beyond state-centric models.
The report also flags the erosion of rights due to populism and authoritarianism.
Yes, these political trends are clearly harming human rights globally, contributing to that decline in freedom we started with.
How does populism impact rights?
Often uses rhetoric dividing society, pure people, versus corrupt elites, enemies. Attacks independent institutions, judiciary, media, rights bodies, frames minority rights as conflicting with majority will, leads to curtailing expression, harassing critics, intensifying culture wars, may claim to champion socioeconomic rights, but often at expense of civil political ones.
And authoritarianism, more direct repression.
Yes, shrinking civic space via restrictive laws, arbitrary detention, torture, surveillance, information control, hollowing out democratic institutions.
And this impacts the international system.
Weakens consensus on norms and institutions. More criticism of international rulings, treaty violations, withdrawals, defunding. Emboldens violators. Weakened enforcement leads to further erosion. It's a vicious cycle.
Finally, this persistent tension, economic interests versus human rights imperatives. Economics often seems to win.
A long-standing, deeply troubling issue. Prioritizing trade, investment often seems to override enforcing human rights. Lack of political will for costly actions against abusers, especially if they're key economic partners.
Examples.
The slow response to Rwanda, partly due to perceived lack of economic interest. Hesitation on strong measures against China over Xinjiang, clearly linked to economic weight. Corporate activities like deforestation in the Amazon often continued despite condemnation. Political will, often lacking when perceived economic risks are high.
Is that narrative being challenged?
Increasingly, research suggests respecting rights actually yields long-term economic benefits: reduced inequality, stability, better business reputation, risk management. Corporate abuses carry costs. Governments are starting to use economic tools, more trade clauses, sanctions, ethical procurement.
But the fundamental challenge remains.
Ensuring the intrinsic value of rights is consistently prioritized over short-term economic maths. Requires strengthening mechanisms to decouple rights from pure economics, fostering greater willingness to bear costs for principles.
This has been a really deep, often sobering look at the global human rights picture. We've seen declining freedoms, a convergence of crises, conflict, authoritarianism, inequality, climate, technology risks, disproportionate impacts on vulnerable groups, Uyghurs, Rohingya, indigenous peoples, LGBTQ+ individuals, the ongoing universality debate.
Right.
Vital work by UN bodies and NGOs facing constraints. Crucial, risky work by individual defenders.
Yeah.
But despite the sobering assessment, the importance of advocacy and cooperation remains clear. We saw examples of resilience, progress, and justice. The universal framework remains an essential benchmark.
Absolutely. It's a challenging landscape, often disheartening, but the principles are more vital than ever. The work of monitoring, documenting, advocating, demanding accountability, it has to continue with renewed vigor. Human rights aren't abstract ideals. They're essential for peace, justice, sustainable development for everyone.
And on that important note, here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to consider. Given how interconnected these global challenges are and that constant tension between economic interests and human rights, what's the single most impactful action that global citizens and the international community could prioritize to really shift things towards a more rights-respecting future? And what fundamental shift in perspective, individual, national, global, would be needed to actually achieve it? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.